I was grabbing coffee with an old friend who's always been a bit of a skeptic when it comes to, well, just about everything.
Ah, we all have one of those.
Exactly. And we got onto the topic of right and wrong, and he leans in, he says, look, unless you've got a direct line to God or a secret code in our DNA, morality is just a lifestyle choice. There's no objective truth to it.
The classic argument. It's either divine command or it's just opinion.
Right. So I decided to try a little thought experiment on him. I asked him to imagine a state of being where every single person he's ever met, including himself, is undergoing the most intense, purposeless suffering imaginable forever.
The absolute bottom.
The absolute bottom. And I asked him, is that state objectively worse than us sitting here having this coffee? He paused for a bit, swirled the ice in his cup, and he admitted, yeah, okay, that would be bad.
But there's a but.
There's always a but. He then hits me with the clincher, but who says I ought to care? Where's the authority that makes it a fact rather than just my preference?
And that is the philosophical knot right there. The gap between is and ought.
It was just a fascinating moment. He's looking at the most horrific possibility in existence, but because he can't find a command or a duty written in the stars, he feels like he has to stay neutral.
He's looking for a moral boss.
A moral boss. That's the perfect way to put it. He was waiting for a shove when he was already standing on the edge of a cliff. That weird, stubborn insistence on needing an ought. That's the knot we need to untie today.
Because we've been taught to think of morality as obeying rules, following some higher authority.
What if that's just a complete misunderstanding of the equipment? What if the difference between a life of flourishing and a life of agony isn't an opinion at all, but a set of cold, hard facts about a landscape we're all navigating?
We need to stop looking for commands.
And start looking at the terrain. That is the core of our deep dive today. We are stopping the search for external commands and starting to rigorously map the terrain of human experience. Our mission is to explore this idea that societal flourishing and suffering are objective, measurable facts, and that objective morality is fundamentally about building the right institutional equipment, the architecture of civilization, to successfully navigate this landscape.
It's about turning a philosophical problem into, really, a technical one, a social engineering problem.
Exactly.
And that thought experiment you opened with, it's not just a compelling story, it's philosophically necessary.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront the limits of traditional moral philosophy, which gets so tangled in that is-ought problem, especially when the stakes are, universal catastrophe.
It paralyzes the conversation.
It does. We need a system that can move us past that paralysis.
Okay, so let's put some philosophical weight behind this. If we're going to claim morality is an objective fact, not a preference, we have to ground it in something verifiable. We're going to be looking at Sam Harris's framework.
Right, and his core argument is that moral questions have objectively right and wrong answers because they relate directly to empirical facts.
Facts about what, exactly?
Facts about the well-being of conscious creatures. That's the bedrock. He defines morally good as behaviors, thoughts, and institutions that increase that well-being.
So by linking morality to well-being, which is something we can theoretically measure.
With neuroscience, psychology, sociology.
Right. He's trying to pull moral questions out of that endless loop of speculative philosophy and put them into the potential realm of science.
The goal is to establish a normative science of morality, a science that can tell us not just what is, but what should be.
And that's the head-on collision with Hume's law. For anyone listening, David Hume famously argued, you can't logically get an ought, a moral prescription from an is, a statement of fact. For centuries, that gap has seemed impossible to cross.
It's been a foundational barrier in philosophy.
So how does this framework even attempt to jump that gap?
Well, the challenge is met by, in a sense, redefining the facts we're dealing with. Harris contends that once we scientifically establish which values and behaviors lead directly to human flourishing, which is an objective state of the brain and society, that objective fact creates the normative basis. It creates the ought.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. If we know for a fact that action A maximizes well-being, then it becomes a fact that we should pursue action A. It's just like saying, if you want to get to Chicago from New York, it is a fact that you should drive west. The goal is objective, so the path to the goal is also objectively preferable.
But that all hinges on having a starting point, an axiom that we all have to agree on, otherwise the argument just goes on forever.
It does.
Where do we, as he says, turn the spade and just stop digging?
The necessary starting point is the inverse of flourishing. It's that state of absolute misery you described. Harris calls it the worst possible misery for everyone, or WPMFE.
Right.
And this state is defined as objectively bad. It must be avoided. The assertion here is that saying WPMFE is bad is. It's like saying a logical statement that contradicts itself is illogical. It's the self-evident functional bottom of the moral scale. We accept consciousness exists, and the worst possible version of it is what we must move away from.
And that's exactly what my friend at the coffee shop struggled with. He saw the WPMFE, he admitted it was bad, but he still needed an authority to tell him he ought to care.
Right. By grounding it in the objective reality of conscious experience itself, we remove the need for that external moral boss. The objective reality of suffering is the authority.
It's a pragmatic objectivity.
Exactly. And this framework lets us visualize morality not as some rigid code, but as a vast, complex
terrain. The peaks in this terrain represent maximum flourishing, the best possible well-being for the most people over time, and the valleys represent misery and suffering.
What I appreciate about that analogy is the immediate honesty that there might not be just one single peak.
Right, there could be multiple paths to that optimal state.
Absolutely. The landscape analogy is key because it acknowledges that there could be many possible paths to flourishing, many different peaks, but there's really only one single worst possible valley, the WPMFE. This allows for cultural and individual variation without giving up on objectivity.
Let's flesh out the health analogy a bit more because I think that makes it really tangible.
Okay, so think about physical health. Health is an objective biological state. We measure things like blood pressure, hormonal balance, physical fitness, longevity. It's real.
Right.
However, the path to optimal health can vary. One person might thrive on, say, a vegan diet and high-intensity interval training. Another might need a keto approach and weightlifting.
Both paths can lead to a peak.
Both can lead to a peak of maximal physical performance. But both paths still share objective facts. If you smoke a pack of cigarettes a day and live on processed junk food, you are objectively moving toward a valley of illness. Morality, in this view, is analogous to health. The goal is measurable, even if the successful routes to get there are diverse.
Now, this definition always invites the simplest, and I think often misleading, critique. People immediately try to reduce it to simple hedonic utilitarianism.
The Ted Bundy calculation.
Exactly. If Ted Bundy gets 10 units of pleasure from his crime, and the victim gets 10 units of pain, does it just net out to 0?
And that's a critical point that needs to be clarified. Harris's defenders are very firm on this. Pleasure is not flourishing.
Yeah.
This is not a simple calculation where we're just adding up little moments of pleasure and pain.
It's a much broader concept.
It is. The goal is the objective well-being of conscious creatures, conceived in a very broad sense. A system that allows for murder already violates the foundational principles you'd need for collective well-being to even exist. So the question itself is kind of fallacious within the framework.
It's like a doctor trying to quantify the temporary health benefits of an assassin's endorphin rush.
Right. The act itself negates the health of the entire community. Flourishing is a complex, long-term collective state, not a momentary feeling.
Okay, so we've established the objective goal flourishing and the objective bottom, which is universal misery. The next step is figuring out science's role in helping us find those peaks. We need to distinguish between different scientific projects here.
Exactly. Harris lays out 3 distinct tasks for science when it comes to morality, and we really need to focus on the middle one.
What's the first one?
The first is the descriptive project. This is all about explaining why humans do what they do in the name of morality. This is the world of evolutionary psychology, anthropology, neuroscience. It's about understanding the origins of our moral behaviors.
So it focuses strictly on what is. Why do we naturally favor our family? Why did certain moral codes pop up in agrarian societies?
Precisely. It's fascinating, but it doesn't give us the ought.
Right. Just because we discover that our evolutionary wiring makes us, say, naturally xenophobic, science has described the behavior, but it hasn't justified it as morally optimal.
Exactly. And that is why we have to move to the second and most crucial project. Normative science.
This is the science of morality itself.
This is where we determine which patterns of thought, behavior, and crucially, institutional design humans should follow to maximize collective flourishing and stay away from that WPMFE.
So this is the prescriptive part. Looking at what should be. This is the engineering stage.
This is the engineering.
I have to challenge this slightly because this is where my skeptical friend would jump in. If the descriptive project explains why people are moral, let's say because altruism gave us a survival advantage, why can't we just use that as the basis for the ought? Why do we need a whole separate normative science?
That's a great question. And the reason is because evolution is a blind process. It's optimized for survival and reproduction, not for optimal well-being.
What worked then might not work now.
Exactly. What was a successful strategy for a small, competing tribal group 10,000 years ago, like a strong in-group bias, is objectively suboptimal for a globally interconnected society of 8 billion people today. The normative project is the conscious technical effort to use reason and data to get past our often flawed primitive wiring and find the highest peak on the modern landscape.
That's a really critical distinction. And that brings us to the third project, which explains why we might fail to act even after we find the truth.
That's the persuasive project. This is the challenge of convincing humans, individually and as a group, to actually change their ways based on the normative findings. This focuses on what could be.
This is where human motivation comes in.
Or the lack of it. Discovering scientifically that action A is objectively best for society doesn't automatically change everyone's habits overnight. People fail to do what they ought to do all the time, even when it's in their own self-interest, like quitting smoking or saving for retirement.
So the failure of people to follow the rule doesn't invalidate the objective truth of the rule itself.
Not at all. Knowing scientifically that a specific diet prevents heart disease is a factual truth, regardless of how many people choose to eat hamburgers.
So our goal here for this deep dive is squarely on that technical normative project, figuring out the optimal system.
Absolutely. The focus is on scientifically determining what is right and separating that from the messy, persistent challenge of motivation. Once we accept that maximizing well-being is the objective goal, the next logical step is to figure out the most effective institutional equipment to achieve it.
And that takes us from abstract philosophy right into the laboratory of survival,
where we can actually test these social systems.
So if flourishing and suffering are objective states, the next hurdle isn't philosophical, it's an engineering problem. How do we take that moral goal and actually build a machine that achieves it?
And this is where we move into highly abstract but surprisingly detailed systems design. We're stepping into an artificial society designed to model collective action in the face of, well, inevitable high-stakes catastrophe.
A laboratory of survival.
It's a multi-agent system that investigates cooperative survival through an iterated game. The setup is an archipelago of islands.
And the setup is designed to be harsh, unforgiving. The islands are autonomous, but their survival is completely interdependent.
Utterly interdependent. And the ultimate non-negotiable core rule is the highest stake possible. No one survives unless everyone survives.
That forces a purely collaborative survival context, a global collective rationality from the outset.
It does. And it creates a game that's defined by 4 critical parameters. First, there's scale, the number of islands or players. Second is uncertainty, especially the unknown timing and magnitude of recurring disasters, which are modeled as random earthquakes.
Okay.
Third, there's complexity, which is the number of interdependent sub-games the agents have to solve at the same time to survive. And fourth is opportunity, the self-organizing mechanisms they have available to build.
And the goal of the simulation is to see which institutional setups allow them to survive under the highest complexity and uncertainty.
Exactly.
I think that complexity parameter is the most challenging piece. It's not just one problem they're solving, it's 3 tangled up subgames, and they have to juggle all 3 at once without one solution breaking another.
That is the engineered dilemma. These are 3 classic resource competition games, and the core finding of the model is that the individually rational choice, what game theorists call the Nash equilibrium solution in any one of these games, is actually detrimental to the others.
Which guarantees a collective failure.
The tragedy is self-reinforcing.
Let's break down those subgames then. We can trace the failure path. It starts with resource extraction, right? The Stag Hunt game.
The Stag Hunt game is the first layer. It deals with resource extraction, and it presents the conflict between individuality and collectivity. Players have to choose between hunting high-reward deer, which requires coordination and has a high risk of failure if that coordination breaks down, or foraging for low-reward fish, which offers a guaranteed individual return. You can do it by yourself.
Okay, so individual rationality, especially in a world with uncertainty, would definitely favor the fish. You secure your own survival, even if it's minimal, rather than risking cooperation for that high collective reward.
Exactly. But if every player consistently chooses the fish, the collective pool of resources they gather is very low. And this provision resource pool immediately feeds into the second problem.
The common pool resource management problem.
The CPR management problem. This deals with resource distribution. It's the classic tragedy of the commons. The common pool of resources is subtractable. If I take a resource, it disadvantages the collective, but it's non-exclusive, meaning anyone can take from it.
So if the stag hunt gives you very few resources to begin with, and then individual rationality dictates grabbing as much of that scarce resource as possible,
The free rider problem.
then that common pool gets starved even further.
It creates a death spiral. Short-term individual appropriation leads directly to long-term collective ruination. And this starved common pool then determines the agent's ability to handle the third and highest stakes game.
The collective risk dilemma.
The collective risk dilemma, CRD. This is the ultimate test, and it's directly related to avoiding that WPMFE, the catastrophic earthquake.
How does it work?
The CRD is what's known as a threshold public goods game. To mitigate the next disaster, the players must contribute resources from their private pools back into the common pool to reach a fixed mitigation threshold.
Okay.
If that threshold is reached, the damages from the next catastrophe are significantly reduced. The dilemma here is the conflict between the short-term individual benefit of keeping your resources free riding and the long-term collective benefit of disaster mitigation.
Okay, so let's trace that whole path of failure based on purely individual rational choice. The Nash equilibrium.
Let's do it.
So first, in the stag hunt, I choose the guaranteed low-reward fish to make sure I get something.
Secure your individual provisioning.
Right. Second, in the CPR, I take as much as I can from that weak common pool before anyone else does.
You appropriate.
And third, in the CRD, I free ride. I hold on to my private resources, and I just hope that everyone else contributes enough to meet that disaster mitigation threshold.
And if every single player follows that individually rational sequence, two things are guaranteed to happen.
Yeah.
The common pool never reaches the mitigation threshold, and the catastrophe guarantees destruction for everyone.
The simulation is designed to prove that the Nash equilibrium means collective destruction.
Yes. Simply giving the agents resources isn't enough. Without changing the rules of how they interact, collective failure is mathematically guaranteed.
Which brings us right back to the objective morality problem. If the goal is objectively to avoid universal suffering, the WPMFE and individual rational behavior guarantees that WPMFE.
Then individual rational behavior, in this context, is objectively immoral.
We need to socially construct a different kind of rationality.
Exactly. The objective moral goal has to be translated into the architecture of resilience. To get past these socially suboptimal outcomes, the agents have to build self-organizing mechanisms, socially constructed resources like institutions, trust, reciprocity, that effectively change the constraints on those resource games.
They're playing meta-level political games to transform the incentives of the lower-level games.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So let's detail the institutional design they built. The Inter-Island Governmental Organization, or IGGO, starting with the most formal mechanism, governance.
Governance is the social construction of conventional rules built by mutual agreement and designed to regulate behavior. The IIG structure is modeled on the separation of powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, because a single centralized command often proves fragile or gets abused.
Okay, so what are the specifics of these elected roles? What gives them actual institutional power over the resources?
The power is institutionalized. It rests with the role, not the individual agent. The judge has judicial power. They are the only agent who can declare an audit of another agent's history to check for rule compliance.
So they enforce the rules.
They enforce the rules and apply sanctions like fines if rules are broken. But crucially, and this reflects a fundamental principle of the rule of law, the judge cannot judge their own actions. There's a built-in check to prevent the ultimate consolidation of legal power.
Okay, and then you have the president, the executive function.
The president is empowered to set the level of taxation from the island's private resources, allocate resources from the common pool, and set the legislative agenda. The optimal tax level is based on the system's uncertainty. The president has to calculate the predicted common pool threshold needed and the expected time until the next disaster.
So it's informed, centralized decision-making.
Correct. And then the speaker handles the legislative side, the actual rules and elections.
What are their powers?
The speaker's primary powers are about managing the institutional infrastructure itself, conducting elections for these roles, and declaring the results of rule votes. And when electing agents to these roles, the IGO uses a board account method, not a simple majority vote.
Why a board account? That seems overly complex. Why not just a simple majority rule?
This is a really crucial detail for institutional design. A simple majority vote can lead to strategic voting or polarization, where a player just pushes for their most preferred candidate and ignores any consensus building.
Right.
The board account, where voters rank candidates and points are assigned based on that rank, is used because it encourages consensus. It rewards candidates who are broadly acceptable to a larger part of the community, not just the favorite of a polarized minority or majority.
So in a critical survival scenario, consensus and stability are paramount. The election mechanism itself is an institution designed to nudge the population toward that stability.
It builds social stability right into the rules. But, and this is a harsh reality often forgotten in institutional design, governance is costly.
How so?
All these proceedings, appointing roles, proposing rules, running audits, they diminish the common pool resources. If the critical mass of players is too small or resources are too scarce, the sheer cost of running the institution can actually contribute to collective failure. Governance is essential, but it is not free.
And governance alone isn't enough. The sources show you need other mechanisms too.
That's right. The second mechanism is trading. This facilitates gift exchanges, deal-making, and resource sharing among the individual islands.
It builds social capital.
Exactly. Trading is essential for establishing strong social networks and for mitigating the wealth imbalances that might naturally occur. It creates reciprocity and a dynamic, decentralized way to redistribute resources. It's the social lubrication that formal rules can't enforce.
Okay, so you have formal rules and informal social networks. What's the third piece?
The third is forecasting. This is the intelligence, the scientific component. Forecasting provides a structured form for information exchange to mitigate risk, especially when uncertainty is high.
When the agents don't know when the next earthquake is coming or how bad it's going to be?
Yes. Agents predict the disaster period or the needed mitigation threshold based on the damage they've received from past events. If an island took heavy damage, they adjust their estimates upward. This mechanism allows the agents to convert perceived risk into quantifiable data, which then feeds the executive function, the president's tax calculation.
So the overall survival probability is completely reliant on the synergies between these three mechanisms.
The experiments confirm that these complex cooperative survival games are, in fact, solvable. A 100% survival rate is feasible, but only when there's sufficient critical mass enough players to absorb the cost of governance, and all three mechanisms are active. It highlights their necessary interdependence. You take one away, and the whole system becomes fragile.
Okay, so this is where we can circle back to the central moral mission, avoiding the WPMFE. We have the objective goal, flourishing, and the institutional equipment. Governance, trade, and forecasting. What happens if one piece is missing or balanced incorrectly? You mentioned a pernicious interaction between forecasting and governance.
This is maybe the most profound lesson from the model for human societies. The simulations clearly showed that forecasting alone, the scientific knowledge of impending doom, what they call the immaculate prophet of doom, was functionally worthless if it couldn't be acted upon.
I want to spend a moment on that because that links directly to real-world failures. Why is the knowledge useless?
The knowledge, no matter how accurate, is useless in the absence of an institutional power to enforce said taxation.
So forecasting tells us we need X resources tomorrow to survive the earthquake.
Right. But governance is the only mechanism that lets the president compel taxation and pool those resources today. Without the rules, without the elected and sanctioned authority, every island acts individually rational, hoards its resources, and guarantees collective failure, even though they know doom is coming.
So merely knowing the objective truth, the climate facts, the public health risks, the resource scarcity, it's not enough to save a system. You need the institutional capacity to mobilize collective action based on that truth. The failure isn't cognitive, it's institutional.
It translates that objective moral requirement, avoiding the valley of misery, into a quantifiable technical problem of institutional design. If your institutions are too weak to enforce resource pooling, your society is functionally incapable of acting on objective truth.
That is a stunning realization. The objective morality we're looking for isn't in a book of rules, it's in the efficiency and stability of our social engineering, which moves us perfectly into the real world, asking, how do we measure the quality of the governance equipment we've already built in modern states?
And this transition takes us right into political science metrics. The source material suggests a fundamental flaw in how Western political science often measures state success. For decades, the emphasis has been almost entirely on institutions that limit or check power.
Things like democracy, rule of law, civil liberties, accountability.
All vital things, but they tell us nothing about the institution that accumulates and uses power, the state apparatus itself, specifically the executive branch and its bureaucracy.
So we need to distinguish between just controlling power and actually wielding it effectively. The difference between, say, despotic power, the ability to issue commands, and infrastructural power.
Infrastructural power, exactly. The government's ability to actually penetrate society and implement policy. Instrumentally defined, governance is a government's ability to make and enforce rules and deliver services, regardless of its democratic structure. We have to separate democratic procedures from governance quality if we want to find the optimal architecture for objective flourishing.
And we can't just use final outputs like literacy rates or health scores as the sole measure of state quality. Why not? If the society is flourishing, doesn't that mean the government is good?
You'd think so, but unfortunately, output measures are heavily influenced by exogenous factors. They aren't solely the result of public action. They're a complex interaction between the state, the environment, and pre-existing social factors: wealth, family structures, social organization.
So a state with low capacity might still get high literacy rates if it's governing a small, wealthy population.
Exactly. While a high-capacity state might struggle if it's governing a massive, impoverished, geographically difficult territory. The state's true ability can be masked or inflated by the context it's in. We need to measure the machinery itself, not the passenger it's carrying.
Okay, so if we aim to measure the objective quality of the state apparatus, its capacity, we have to treat output as the dependent variable that's explained by state quality, not as a measure of it.
Correct. Which also means measures of government efficiency, a ratio of inputs to outcomes, are also inadequate. We need direct metrics of institutional muscle.
So getting past outcomes, what are the two core dimensions that Francis Fukuyama suggests define high-quality governance?
They are capacity and autonomy. And it's the interaction between these two that determines the overall effectiveness and quality of governance.
Let's start with capacity. The ability to get things done, measured by resources and professionalization. How do we objectively quantify that institutional muscle?
The most direct proxy is extractive capacity, specifically tax extraction rates. This measure is incredibly useful because it proxies capacity in two ways.
How so?
First, it requires substantial institutional muscle, the capacity to successfully extract taxes, especially complex ones like income or wealth taxes. Second, successful extraction provides the government with the resources it needs to operate in other domains, like funding education, health, and infrastructure.
Let's dig into that technical detail. What kind of bureaucratic infrastructure do you need to collect an income tax versus, say, a sales tax?
It's an enormous difference. Collecting a sales tax is relatively low capacity. You take it at the point of sale.
Yeah.
But collecting an income tax requires penetrating every household and business.
You need a huge apparatus.
And a huge apparatus. Detailed, centralized databases, legal enforcement systems, professional auditors, sophisticated data analysis to spot evasion, a functional judiciary to uphold the rules. A state that can administer a complex progressive income tax demonstrates far higher infrastructural capacity than one that just relies on easy customs duties.
So extractive capacity, measured by the tax to GDP ratio, is a robust measure of state penetration.
It is. And beyond pure extraction, the other critical capacity measure is the level of education and professionalization of government officials, the presence of what are called islands of excellence. Think of the massive improvement in the quality of central banks or regulatory bodies in many developing nations over the last few decades.
That's due to higher professionalism and technical training.
Exactly. That institutional knowledge base is capacity.
Okay, so capacity is the muscle, resources, and training. The second dimension, autonomy, sounds more like the leverage or the operational freedom of that muscle.
That's a good way to think of it. Autonomy is the degree of independent judgment and discretion permitted to the bureaucracy relative to the political principals who appointed them. It's inversely related to the number and nature of mandates issued by those principals.
So too many rules means low autonomy.
Too many detailed, overlapping, or contradictory mandates leads to micromanagement or subordination. The goal is to avoid both extremes.
You're looking for a sweet spot. The bureaucracy needs enough discretion to act effectively, but not so much that it just starts serving its own interests instead of the public's.
Exactly. The relationship between autonomy and government quality follows an inverted U-curve. At the extreme of complete subordination, too little autonomy, the bureaucracy is just choked by excessive rules. It can't make rapid decisions, and performance is poor.
And the other extreme.
At the other extreme, complete autonomy means the bureaucracy has escaped political control entirely and starts setting its own goals, independent of what society needs.
Is there a historical example of what happens when a high-capacity state has way too much bureaucratic autonomy?
The classic examples are Imperial Germany and Japan before the World Wars. Both had highly professional, powerful state bureaucracies, especially in the military and foreign policy.
And they achieved extreme autonomy.
They did. In Japan, autonomous military leaders began formulating foreign policy objectives on their own, completely bypassing elected or civilian political authorities. It led the nation down these aggressive, militaristic paths that the political principles couldn't control. That's the failure mode of too much autonomy. The state apparatus becomes a self-serving entity, no matter how professional it is.
That makes the autonomy variable seem less like a philosophical ideal and more like a technical calibration problem. Does the optimal level of autonomy change based on a state's capacity?
It is entirely contingent on capacity. This is where the framework becomes a real engineering tool. For low-capacity countries, those with less professional staff, weaker enforcement, you need less autonomy and more rigid rules to curb corruption.
We see this advice given to developing nations all the time.
We do. Development agencies often advise strict, transparent rules to reduce bureaucratic discretion. It echoes Robert Klitgaard's famous formula: corruption equals discretion minus accountability. If you can't ensure accountability because of low capacity, you have to reduce discretion to prevent corruption.
Which is a major driver of misery and failure. But for high-capacity states, the equation flips.
For high-capacity states, those already full of highly educated, well-paid professional staff, you want to shift that optimal point to the right. They need more autonomy and flexibility.
You permit innovation and risk-taking.
Exactly. If you bind a highly competent bureaucracy with excessive rules, you get the paralysis we see in many developed nations today. In the U.S., for instance, many political scientists argue the system needs to move right on the autonomy curve to unleash innovation. The optimal objective architecture is dynamic. It's contingent on the resources and professionalism of the agents within it.
This connects directly back to our island simulation. If the islanders were completely incompetent low capacity, the optimal IOGO would have far more binding, centralized rules and zero discretion for the president or judge.
But if they're highly competent, the system needs the flexibility of the judge's interpretation and the president's allocation power to handle uncertainty. The empirical terrain confirms the abstract model. Objective flourishing requires technically optimal institutional design, defined by that calculated interplay between capacity and autonomy.
So now we have to look at what happens when political systems try to cheat this objective reality, when they replace the slow, technical work of institution building with something much cheaper and more immediate: personality, charisma.
This failure mode is a widespread phenomenon. It's best exemplified by the deep entrenchment of cults of personality across various political arenas, often at the explicit expense of institutional capacity.
The sources cite Indian politics as a prime example here. The current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, is described as a once-in-a-generation political phenomenon whose personal image is just ubiquitous.
His face is used as a mascot for welfare schemes, an icon on government websites, it's on billboards everywhere. There's even a massive cricket stadium named after him.
And this isn't just an anomaly tied to the current ruling party. The source material really emphasizes that this personality cult pervades all levels of Indian governance, and it stretches back decades.
You see it with state chief ministers whose faces are plastered across public infrastructure, often alongside family members to emphasize a dynasty. Earlier figures like Indira Gandhi actively cultivated this personalized legitimacy. The slogan was, "India is Indira, and Indira is India."
The sheer scale of the self-promotion is striking. The sources note that a visitor will see Mr. Modi's face more often in one day in Delhi than Xi Jinping's in a month in Beijing. That contrast feels very significant. It tells a story about different legitimation strategies.
It does. It speaks volumes about the institutional environment. Modi is operating in a vast, vibrant, information-flooded democracy where elections are constant and political competition is fierce. He actively needs to seek and maintain legitimacy through this pervasive, highly visible self-promotion. He needs that persuasive project to constantly reinforce his authority.
Whereas Xi Jinping,
on the other hand, operates in a state with complete institutional control and high infrastructural power. He doesn't need the same level of pervasive self-advertising. His legitimacy rests on the objective delivery of economic results and the deep penetration of the state apparatus. So he can appear more reticent, more dignified, because the underlying technical capacity is doing the heavy lifting of governance.
But the core problem isn't the billboards or the charisma itself. It's the cost that this personality obsession has on the necessary institutional equipment.
Absolutely. The reliance on personality politics comes at the cost of building state capacity that can survive bad leaders and incompetent officials. India, with its scale and complexity, is far too massive to be run successfully by a handful of charismatic individuals.
And the result is a system where the governance structures often remain rooted in, the feudal colonial system they inherited at independence?
That's the critique. And the consequence of that fragile institutional capacity is a profound lack of continuity.
Policies just flip wildly with every change in government.
Precisely. Because the policies are tied to the person, the political principle, not to an impartial, professional, high-capacity bureaucracy. The system struggles to accumulate institutional memory and resilience. It's a direct failure to invest in the normative project, the objective science of governance, by prioritizing the short-term persuasive project of cultivating a personal brand.
And we can see this exact institutional failure mirrored back in the cooperative survival simulations. The system failed not because the agents were bad, but because the architecture allowed institutional power to consolidate without sufficient checks.
That is the link. Let's look closely at a specific experiment, Trial D1. In this trial, the essential framework was there. Governance was active, but a crucial social mechanism, trading, was absent.
Okay, what happened?
The result was the emergence of the iron law of oligarchy. Because the formal democratic procedures like voting and rulemaking were in place, but the social networks and resource equalization were missing, one agent island 1 was able to occupy and maintain all institutional roles at the same time.
Judge, president, and speaker.
All of them. This concentration of power meant the island was immune to sanctions, and it received all the government salaries derived from the common pool.
So even with democratic rules, the system just degenerated into a single-point failure. A highly skewed autocracy. They called it an enlightened dictatorship.
And this is key. The collective did survive. They avoided the WPMFE, but the distribution of resources was heavily and legally concentrated by that powerful oligarchical island.
Island 1 used its institutional power, the legitimate roles of taxer, allocator, enforcer, to systematically accrue resources far beyond the others. They contributed, sure, but they were taking salaries and making allocations that favored their own long-term position.
The lesson isn't just that oligarchy is bad. It's that institutional power, when it's unchecked by social mechanisms, becomes a tool for self-enrichment, even if the formal rules are being followed.
And that institutional weakness was the absence of the trade mechanism.
Exactly. Without trade, a well-established social network and decentralized reciprocity couldn't form. There was no mechanism for spontaneous wealth redistribution or for forming decentralized opinions that could challenge the concentration of institutionalized power in the elections. Isolated governance became a weapon.
So the comparison to Trial D2, where trade was active, is crucial for understanding how to engineer a fair solution.
In Trial D2, with the trade mechanism active, the system prevented that consolidation of power. You saw a much fairer distribution of resources and a much wider, more randomized spread of institutional power among the islands. Powers was rotating.
The critical insight, then, is that institutional power, governance, has to be accompanied by mutually reinforcing mechanisms like trade and forecasting.
They facilitate the strong social links and resource equalization you need to prevent the consolidation of power and ensure a resilient, fair democracy.
The simulations and the empirical data on state capacity essentially prove the same thing. The objective path to flourishing isn't about having a charismatic leader or simple rules. It's about having the right interdependent mechanisms to keep power decentralized, resources distributed fairly, and technical capacity high.
The sources really bring us full circle, back to your opening thought experiment. Morality is not a lifestyle choice. It's not a matter of preference. It's a factual, technical problem of maximizing flourishing and minimizing suffering.
And that problem is solved through social engineering. The path toward an objective morality requires translating that philosophical goal, avoiding the worst possible misery for everyone, into measurable institutional facts.
And that institutional work involves, I think, 3 major non-negotiable architectural requirements. First, you have to identify the optimal point between bureaucratic capacity and autonomy in real-world governance.
Yeah.
You have to recognize that the sweet spot is entirely contingent on the state's professionalism and resources, as Fukuyama detailed. It's a constant technical calibration.
Second, you have to establish the necessary interdependent self-organizing mechanisms, governance, trade, and forecasting that are required to solve these complex collective dilemmas. The simulations prove that no single mechanism is enough on its own. The absence of one can lead to these pernicious failure modes like oligarchy or just useless scientific knowledge.
And third, it requires recognizing that political systems that substitute personality and charisma for these objective, measurable institutional mechanisms are fundamentally fragile. They're prone to systemic failure, and they are ultimately incapable of delivering the long-term collective flourishing that's required to move toward those moral peaks.
They choose the easy illusion over the hard engineering truth.
They do.
The objective reality is that if we accept that the ultimate moral goal is the avoidance of universal misery and the pursuit of measurable flourishing, then the most immediate and critical moral undertaking is the non-negotiable technical work of building robust, measurable, and mutually supporting institutions that prioritize collective resilience and technical capacity over individual charisma or simple adherence to historical, often suboptimal rules.
That institutional equipment is the science of morality in practice.